Hello people of YouTube, it's Deepak here, and welcome to DCS World 2.7.9 and Eagle Dynamics FA-18C Hornet module. Welcome to tutorial 3, Air-to-Air Radar BVR modes. So, what is BVR? BVR stands for Beyond Visual Range. There's also WVR, which is within visual range. And as the names might suggest, BVR is when your primary sensor is something like your radar or forward-looking infrared or infrared search and track. And WVR is when you are engaging a contact primarily using your eyes, although you'll probably also be supported by things like your radar and so on. So today we're just going to cover BVR. We're not going to cover any weapons employment, that will come later. We're not going to cover the data link, and we're also not going to cover the azimuth and elevation display, which is the second type of display, air-to-air radar display that the F-18 can have. We're just going to cover the attack radar display, which is a very traditional B-scope style display, pretty much exactly the same as what I've already demonstrated in tutorial 3 for the F-16. Now, much like the F-16, the F-18 has RWS and TWS modes, that's range while scan and track while search. They operate in much the same way. In some ways the F-18's radar is slightly more advanced. It has a greater range, greater azimuth scan, and its sensor integration is slightly better, in my opinion. It has quite an interesting unified concept of target identification and information sharing between the different sensors, which the F-16 sort of lacks. So in some ways this is going to be a little bit more complex, but in other ways it's slightly more automated as well, and we'll cover that during the course of this tutorial. So what radar are we talking about here? Well, in the FA-18C we have the APG-73 fire control radar, housed in the grey radome on the nose of the aircraft. It's a pulse Doppler radar with look-down, shoot-down capability, much like the one in the F-16. That means that we have the ability to pick up and track targets against ground and sea clutter, which can be quite important. So, let's get into the office, and of course the very first thing we need to think about is, how do we actually bring the radar up? The aircraft is currently in pretty much the same configuration we left it in the previous tutorial after taking off from the carrier. So we have the FCS page on the left and the checklist page on the right. Now there are a few different ways that we can do this, all of which are pretty damn quick. So we're currently in Nav Mode. Nav Mode is the default mode. You have push buttons here for air-to-air and air-to-ground master modes, and these are toggles. So you can toggle into air-to-air, and if you toggle back out again, you're back at Nav Mode. So if I just click air-to-air mode, a few things are going to happen. Automatically, it's going to select the AIM-9X, it's going to put my stores page on the left, it's going to put my attack radar on the right. It actually leaves the center display alone. It's left however you had it. So that's a pretty quick way of getting ready to fight, and when the attack radar comes up by default it's in range while scan. Let's come back out of air-to-air and back into nav mode. Let's return our aircraft into its previous configuration there. And what's another way of doing this? Whenever you don't have a display on the right-hand DDI which can accept sensor of interest, which can accept cursor input, that is, pressing sensor select switch right will always immediately give you the attack radar display. So I just pushed sensor select right, and we have the attack radar, and it is sensor of interest. We can tell that because it has the diamond and the dot on the right-hand side there. So that's also a pretty quick way of doing it. There's an even better way, in my opinion, and in fact probably the superior way of getting everything set up for air-to-air combat. The F-18 has a switch in it called the weapon select switch. It's a 4-way hat switch. Pushing this switch forward will put you into air-to-air mode and select the gun. Pushing it down will select the Sidewinder. Pushing it left will select Sparrow. Pushing it right will select AMRAAM. This, in my opinion, is the quickest way to have the aircraft set up for air-to-air combat. So let's demonstrate that. I'm going to push weapon select to the right, and you'll notice a bunch of stuff happened. I've selected the AMRAAM, that's confirmed by the heads-up display. I'm in air-to-air master mode. I have stores page on the left, I have attack radar on the right, and the attack radar is my sensor of interest. So pretty quick, a pretty good way of doing this. Now if I push my sensor select switch to the left, it's given me the azimuth elevation display on the left there and made it my sensor of interest. If I push to the right, it makes the attack radar my sensor of interest. So you can see left, right, left, right. That makes it very easy to swap these. As I said before, I'm not covering the azimuth elevation display today though. So let's return to the stores page on the left there. And now you can see on the right hand side I have my radar as my sensor of interest. So that is how, that's the 3 different ways, there are probably more in fact, that I can bring up the attack radar display on my right DDI. Okay, let's take a quick look at the symbology of the attack radar now. I'm going to bring the simulation out of pause. One of the first things you'll notice is that in yellow I have a cursor. And this cursor, much like with the F-16, displays the vertical scan volume above and below. So if I move my cursor up to the end here, I can see that I'm scanning between 6,000 and 33,000 feet. If I bring my cursor all the way down to the bottom of the display, I'm only scanning between 18 and 22,000 feet. Now this is because the scan volume is emitted from the nose of the aircraft as a cone, which expands out as you go further and further. So the further away we go, and if I bump out my range to 80 nautical miles here, all the way out at the end of that range, I'm scanning between about 50,000 feet and minus 10,000 feet. So that's a really big cone out at that point. And then of course all the way down here near the aircraft, I'm flying at 19,000 feet, so I'm really only scanning between my own altitude and a couple of thousand feet above when I'm right down at the lowest possible range here. Let's bump that back down to 40. Okay, so first things first, let's go around the outside of the display and take a little look at all of the options that appear on the push buttons. I'm actually just going to center this up nicely so we get a good display of all of this. So going across the top push buttons, we have the bar scan that we're currently doing. We're currently doing a 4-bar scan. The number beside that denotes the current bar being scanned, and I can click this to switch between 6 bars, 1, 2, 4, 6. I'm going to leave it on 2 bars for now. Obviously the fewer vertical bars that you scan, the quicker the updates to the radar. We then have silence. If I hit this button, the radar will go into silent mode, and that basically means it's not currently emitting. This cross at the bottom left of the display is the radar's way of reinforcing to us that it's not currently emitting. And I can click active and do a single scan, and then it'll go back out of active mode again and into silent. So silent will remain boxed. I can do another click, do another single scan. And for the single scan, what it's going to do is it's going to scan both of my bars, and then it's going to stop and go back into silent. Let's drop it out of silent now, and we're back in normal mode. In RWS, we have a push button for arrays. If I click that, it will drop all of the history of the currently displayed bricks in RWS mode. Here we have our currently displayed range and the diamond confirming that this is our sensor of interest. Up and down arrows here will allow us to change the range. We can display as little as 5 nautical miles and as many as 160. Set will allow us to save the current setup of the radar, so all of these parameters, and it means that the radar will go back to those parameters later. We can reset, and it will actually put everything back the way it should be. We have boxed here the option for Nctr. This is non-cooperative target recognition. This only really operates out to about 25 nautical miles, but what this means is that the radar will fire pulses down the intakes or exhaust, depending on the orientation of the enemy aircraft, and try to identify the aircraft type based on its geometry. So that's something you normally want to leave on. We've got the data push button here, which will take us into the data page, allows us to adjust some further options of the radar. We've got Chan, that would normally allow us to change what channel the radar is operating on. At the top left here we have confirmation the radar is in operate mode and the channel it's currently using. That's not simulated though, it doesn't really do very much in the sim. We've got our currently selected azimuth scan. We're on 80 degrees, we could bump that to 140. Or drop it to as little as 20. Obviously, the less elevation, the fewer bars we're scanning, the faster the refresh we're going to get on the radar. Mode button, it doesn't do anything. We've got the PRF. We're currently in interleaved, which means it'll flip between high and medium PRF. We can also manually switch it to medium, high, or return to interleaved. And then we've got this indication here just confirming that radar is primary source of information. Up here, we have confirmation that we're in range while scan. Clicking this can switch us between TWS and RWS. We're going to leave it in RWS for now. Furthermore, inside the display, this bar is the current azimuth scan position of the radar. This caret is the current elevation of the radar. Using the elevation control on your throttle, you can actually move the radar's elevation manually, set the center of the bar scan that you want. That will update the top and bottom scan volumes displayed on the cursor, or you can recenter it and it'll go back to normal. Down the right hand side we have range indications. So for example, let's drop it to 40. This would be 10, 20, 30 and 40 nautical miles. There's then the dugout across the top. This is for radar returns that don't have range information, so basically jamming targets. Across the top we have the kind of elevation, sorry, not the elevation, the azimuth information. So this line here is bore sight, that's the nose of the aircraft. We then have 30 degrees, 60 degrees and 70 degrees off the nose. And that's how you can tell roughly where targets are. These range and azimuth indications are repeated on the left and on the bottom of the display as well. And then finally we have our own ship information. So across the top we have our aircraft's current heading, bottom left we have our current Mach number and airspeed in knots, and at the bottom right we have our current altitude. And that's all of the information that's displayed on here as standard. Okay, now let's take a look at the data page. If I select data, I can actually control some information about what is actually displayed on the radar, the attack radar screen. At the top right here, we have our current history when in RWR. We're currently displaying 8 returns for every given target. You can have that at 16, 32, or as little as 2. I'm going to leave it on 4 for now. Down the right hand side here we have the option to trigger a one-look raid scan. We'll cover raid a little bit later, but it's basically a way of picking out close targets in close formation basically. We have colour. Toggling colour on and off means that we can have purely grayscale. This might be useful, I don't know, maybe for night vision goggle use, or we can display colors again. MSI is multi-sensor integration. This basically displays or hides information from the data link for the most part. LTWS is latent track while scan. This allows us to actually build a track file even when we're in range while scan for targets which are your current launch and steer target, in other words a bugged target, or the target that's currently underneath your cursor. This is actually quite useful, so you usually want to have this on. The only downside of course is that it might increase the refresh rate of the radar because it has to devote processing power to figuring out a whole lot of information about the targets it's doing LTWS for. We've got the Declutter. This will control whether or not you're displaying your flight path marker and horizon bars or not. In most cases you're going to declutter that from the display. Bvr will display or hide the bearing range altitude call out that you get for the current radar cursor position. This is actually quite useful, so you're normally going to leave that turned on. LDF is not implemented. The speed gate can be in normal or wide modes. Normal mode is tuned for picking up common military aircraft types, so jets, turboprops, things like that. If you put it into wide mode, it will extend the speed gate, and it means that the radar will not reject very slow moving targets. By default it does. This means that you're going to be more likely to pick up things like helicopters and civilian aircraft that might be flying very slow. Most of the time you'll leave this in normal. That's going to declutter the radar a bit. You then also have Rwr Attack. This controls whether or not we see RWR indications on the attack radar. This is usually quite a good thing to do because you can compare radar contacts with RWR indications and figure out the aircraft type. These will be displayed across the top line here as triangles with radar type displayed inside the triangle. And pressing data again will take you out of the data page and back into the normal page. Okay, now we're going to cover RWS mode. So something to note, there's a kind of quick shortcut in RWS mode. Let's actually pause it very quickly. By default, RWS is probably the mode that you're going to use to try to acquire targets at long range, because just like in the F-16, it does the least processing, and so is always going to generate the greatest kind of ranges, the greatest acquisition ranges, basically. In RWS, you're just displaying these bare bricks with a little bit of historic information, which you can control within the data page. The other thing to note is that in RWS, the closest detected target to you will always have the ACQ cross on it. You'll see this cross here. This is a feature of RWS mode. So what does this mean? The ACQ cross means that if you trigger what's called A-18C, which is the auto acquisition mode of the radar, it will immediately try to STT lock that target. So what does this look like in practice? I'm going to just move my view so you can see the HUD and the radar at the same time. I'm going to come out of pause. So I would have pressed sensor select switch right to make the radar my sensor of interest. If I press sensor select switch right again, you'll see the radar says, it said ACQ for just a moment. I'm going to pause so that we can see all of that information. For just a moment at the top left, it said AACQ, and then it STT'd that target. Now, if I zoom down on the target now, you'll see that we have some different information. We're now in single target track. All the other tracks have disappeared. The radar has automatically centered the antenna on the currently selected target. It's automatically done an IFF query, and we've already gotten the response from that IFF query. I'm just going to actually zoom right down on this so that you can get a really good look at this symbology here. So what have we got? Well, now that we've locked the target, we have some additional information. Left-hand side of the target, we have the target's current MAC number. This line denotes the target's current heading. That's confirmed at the top left. We can see the target has a heading of 357 degrees. Our heading is 354. Right-hand side is the target's altitude in thousands of feet. It's currently at 19,000 feet. The star in the middle, and this is standard symbology you'll see in other modes as well. Whenever you see a star, that is your L and S target. So L and S stands for launch and steer. That means that that target is currently, it's the one that all of the symbology in your HUD is pointing to, basically. So if I now switch over to the HUD, we can see here on the HUD, we have a diamond. Diamond denotes hostile. This aircraft has been confirmed hostile by our own aircraft's IFF. If the aircraft was also hostile based on data link information, there'd be a little hat above the diamond, which would also be half of a diamond. So it would have like a caret above here. We don't currently have data link, so I don't have that information. And then we have all the standard information. Steering dot, we have our allowable steering envelope, and we have range indications around the outside of that envelope. I'm not going to cover all of that information today, though. Down the right-hand side, we have that this is a radar contact, current closure rate, where actually it's pulling away from us, and its current range. And if we look down here, we will see that in addition to this information, we have the LAR displayed at the bottom, and that's the launch allowable range. So you've got maximum range, the no escape range, and then minimum range, all displayed straight down the line for the antenna position. So quite a lot of information. We also have the allowable steering and the steering dot repeated on the attack radar as well. So this is all of that information. You can see how quick that was, because that was the closest target to us. We could have simply pushed sensor select switch right to make the radar our sensor of interest, and then pressing right again immediately locked that target, and we're now in STT, and we could employ our weapon. Now, we've got some additional options while we're in STT. We've got a push button here to go straight into TWS if we wanted to. That would actually drop the target as an STT, but make it launch and steering within TWS. And then we have RTS RWS, and that means return to scan. So I can press this push button to return to normal RWS and to drop that target, or I can press nose wheel steering. Let's come out of pause. I'm going to push nose wheel steering. and we've now dropped that target. And what it's done is, by default, it's given us that target as launch and steering, but it's continuing to do an RWS scan around it. This is one of the latent track while scan modes. And then actually we've now lost it after a period of time, and we've now just got the standard scan. So that's fine. What's another way of us doing this? Well, we could put our cursor over one of these targets, and let me just pause for a moment. While we have the cursor over a target, this is another feature of latent track while scan. In latent track while scan, while the cursor is over the target, we get track while scan style symbology, including the hafu. Now, this is probably a moment where I should describe the hafu to you. The hafu is this symbol. It has two halves, a top half and a bottom half. The top half is always the information supplied by your own ship or your aircraft's own sensors. The bottom half is information provided by the data link. And off-board sensors, in effect. So this current one that we've got here is actually what you're generally going to start off with. HAFU, by the way, stands for Hostile, Ambiguous, Friendly, Unknown. This symbology is unknown, and it's called the thin staple. So these half squares are called staples. If it's a thin staple, so the top line is thin, that means unknown. Targets always start off as unknown. Because you don't know what the target is. So unknown is this thin staple, and it's yellow. Friendly would be a half circle, and it'd be green, and that's when a target is confirmed friendly. A thick staple is when the top line is thick and it's square, and that's ambiguous. And ambiguous means that you've not identified the target, or the target identification does not match what you're receiving from the data link yet. So you could have, for example, say half of a diamond on the bottom, which would mean hostile, and the top could be ambiguous because you've not actually used your own IFF to confirm that. And as I've just hinted at, a diamond or half of a diamond is hostile, and it's displayed in red. So this target right now is unknown. We have no idea what this is. I'm going to come out of pause. So if we hold our cursor over this target, oh, we actually lost it for a moment. Let's actually reduce the scan volume, because this is a really big scan volume we have right now. I'm going to drop that scan volume to 60, and we're going to get much better updates now. So once again, I'm going to put it over this guy, and I'm going to depress sensor select. That's going to fire an IFF, and we should get an IFF response from him. I'm going to do it again. And we're not getting an IFF response. I can also depress my TDC, and it will basically try to lock that target. No, I lost him. For whatever reason, we're having a hard time picking this aircraft up. Let's drop our scan volume even further. I'm going to zoom out a touch so we can see all the symbology. So let's drop that to 40 and see if we can get a better acquisition on that. Still not seeing them. Let's try dropping... Oops, no, not increasing. Dropping the radar elevation just a little bit. Maybe they're below us. Nope, they're not below us. So now let's increase the elevation a little bit and see if they're perhaps above us. And we've completely lost them. Now, the reason for that... I'm going to hit reset just now. The reason for that might be that they are flying kind of 90 degrees left or right of us, and that means that their closure rate is very, very low. You saw that actually when I locked him up before, his closure was at minus 50 knots, so he was actually very, very close to our airspeed. So actually, what I could do is I could just throttle up and close the distance, and that might make it a little bit easier. While we're waiting for that, I'm going to zoom out, and I happen to know that these targets up here are friendly. So I'm going to try the IFF trick on these guys and see if I get an IFF response. I'm currently not, so let's depress TDC and lock them up. And whenever you lock up a target, it automatically does IFF, and you can see here he's now a half circle and in green, which means it's confirmed friendly. So I'm going to go ahead and press nose wheel steering, dump that target, and see if we can pick up those guys who are closer to us now. But no, I've got no joy. I'm not picking them up at all. That's probably perfectly normal. Almost certainly the reason for that is very low closure rate. That is a problem that you will have from time to time with all radars, actually, both the Hornet's radar and the F-16 radar. Let's bring the aircraft out of active pause, because that's going to make things so much more normal. We'll actually have a... we will have motion relative to our targets without taking into account just their velocity, which will be probably better for the radar. Bump this out to 60 degrees. And hopefully these guys are going to reappear in our scan volume. But that's pretty much everything you can do with RWS. The only things you can really do is hover your cursor over them and get latent track while scan information, or you can depress your TDC and lock up the target. Another little trick, let's actually bump the range out a little bit so we can see these other targets more easily. You can actually define a second target. So here we go. I've gone ahead and locked this guy up just now, and if I move over another one in the formation and depress again, I've now defined what's called a DT2. Let's pause just so we see that symbology there. One thing to confirm is that the symbology for a friend on the HUD is a square. So if you see a diamond on your HUD, that's an enemy. If you see a square, it's either going to be an unknown or a friendly, and that's actually confirmed by the text friend underneath, so you know that you're really not supposed to shoot them. So we now have an LNS and a DT2. So what does that mean? An LNS is launch and steer, as I said before. That's basically the current target that's giving you all of your launch and steer information. But the DT2 is a secondary target. We're also devoting some of the radar's time to scanning this second target. And the second target appears as a cross on the HUD. You'll also notice that we have launch acceptable regions for both the LNS and the DT2 at the same time. What can we do with this? Well, this is kind of like bugging targets in the F-16. If I unpause just now, if I hit nose wheel steering, I can flip these targets. So I'm now targeting the right-hand one, now targeting the left-hand one. This is enough information for an AMRAAM shot. I could fire my AMRAAM at the left-hand target, tap nose wheel steering, and fire on the right-hand target. So while the F-16 is capable of doing this for quite a number of targets, I think something like 6, in the Hornet we can only do this for 2 targets in RWS. So we have our primary launch and steer, and we have our DT2. So, there you go. Nose wheel steering allows me to flip between these two. But of course we're not going to fire on these guys because they're friends. And I just lost the lock anyway. So, that is pretty much everything that you can do in RWS. There are some additional features that are common with RWS and TWS, but I'll cover them in the TWS section, which is coming in just a moment. Okay, let's cover TWS now. I've reset the scenario, and we have the faraway group who are friendly and this closer group who are enemy. I'm going to tap this push button here to put us into TWS, and I'm going to pause for just a moment and go over some of this symbology. Now, one thing to note is that in TWS, because the radar needs to do so much more processing, you actually lose some of the modes that you can operate the radar in with regards to azimuth and bar scans. So in TWS, the only allowable modes are 2 bars 80 degrees, 4 bars 40 degrees, or 6 bars 20 degrees. The 1 bar 120 is no longer available. That's only an RWS mode. So what will happen is if I change my azimuth to a mode that is not compatible with my current number of bars, it will automatically change them. So you don't need to worry too much about this. Another thing to note that's different in TWS, in RWS your antenna elevation is always manual. You always have the ability to move it yourself. In TWS, you have automatic and manual modes, and these differ a little bit. In manual mode, both the azimuth and the elevation are manually controlled. So as I move the cursor, I can actually demonstrate this now, as I move my cursor, my scan volume will move to try and keep both my current tracks and my cursor as much as possible within the scan volume. If I put it into automatic, I lose manual control of the antenna, and the azimuth will automatically be centered as best as possible on my current tracks. Now, the next thing you're going to notice is that all of my tracks now have HAFUs. That's because these are actual track files and not just raw hits, like they are in RWS. In RWS, we just have bricks. In TWS, we're actually building track files. So we have these track files here. We can see that all of these are currently unknown, and they're numbered. And they're numbered in order of importance. And it uses various different ways of determining importance. But by default, if they're all unknown, the importance is just going to be in order of range. Whoever's closest is going to be the most interesting. Of course, in the event that you've identified some of these as hostile, that makes hostile ones much more interesting, of course. So what can we do with this? Let's bring it out of pause. Oh, by the way, we have this option at the top here called hits. If I remove that, that removes the display of bricks. So something to note is that the aircraft can only track and display 10 track files at a time. Everything beyond 10 will just be standard brick hits, and we can turn them on and off using the hits button. And you can have up to 64 hits, so we can actually track a lot of stuff, but only 10 targets will actually be proper track files. So, if I press nose wheel steering, the highest priority track file will become my launch and steering target. Now, unlike in RWS, this doesn't mean I lose visibility of the other targets. It also means that I immediately do an IFF scan, and you can see these further away ones were immediately identified as friendly. These closer ones are still showing as unknown or as ambiguous right now, so we don't really know what these are. That probably means that they are enemy. If I move my cursor over them, I get more information, as before, Mach number and altitude. And the other thing I can do is, if I have my cursor over somebody, I can hit expand. Actually, I don't have a launch and steering target. Let's press nose wheel steering. I have the diamond, sorry, the star, in fact, on my LNS. Oh, I actually lost them. Let's come out of active pause. Their aspect and relative speed to me is probably causing me problems here. And hopefully we'll regain those targets. Note that these ones here, if a track file goes outside of your currently displayed range, for a period of time it will continue to display on the border. So we know the azimuth to these, but we don't know their current range. If I bounce out the range, I will then get the proper indication of the range. So if it has a track file for them and they go out of the scope, it'll just pin them to the edge. There we go. We've got a friend again. So I'm going to make him an LNS, and then I'm going to press expand. And I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to explain. Actually, maybe I should unpause so we build up the rest of it. What expand is going to do is it's going to center on my current LNS with a 22-degree scan for 10 nautical miles. So it's basically zooming in. This is a much zoomed in version of my display, and this allows me to pick out aircraft from a formation, which can be very, very useful. Oh, there we go. I was about to say I'm not picking up anymore, but now I just did. So I've now got an LNS, and I've also got a next priority track there showing as number 1, and there's a number 2. So if I press nose wheel steering, I then go from 1 to 2, press it again, I go back to number 1, press it again, I've gone to the 4th one, press it again, I go to the 3rd one. So I can actually just press NWS all the time to flip between all of these tracks. And this works in expanded mode, and it will simply move to center my display on the current LNS, even all the way out to these guys who are not at the same range. So that's quite useful. And while I have one of these LNS, I can fire on it. So although I don't have the ability to bug many, many targets like the F-16 does, I could now fire, nose wheel steering, fire, nose wheel steering, oh, it's the same one again, nose wheel steering, fire, nose wheel steering, fire. You do have to kind of pay attention because the priorities get recalculated from time to time, so the order in which you're nose wheel steering through these might not always remain the same. So this is quite fancy, this is quite useful. Now, I can also put my cursor over my current LNS, depress, and it's going to put me into a single target track, just like before. I can press nose wheel steering, and it will take me back out of that. It will basically undesignate that target, and I'm now back in the normal track while scan. So that's pretty useful. Once again, let's designate one of these guys as my LNS, and then I'm going to press raid. What raid mode is going to do, well, for some reason that's my launch and steering. That's not what I want. I want number 1. Let's hit nose wheel steering. And again. And again. And again. There we go. Okay, now this guy's my LNS. I'm going to press RAID, and what RAID will do is it's kind of like expand mode, but it doesn't continue to make tracks for those that are outside of the scan volume. So this again is a 22-degree azimuth scan for 10 nautical miles, centered on my current LNS. And using this, I can pick out these aircraft in this formation, who otherwise would be actually quite difficult for me to engage. And you can see at the bottom it says scan RAID, and I'm now in this zoomed in view, and I can select my DT2. In this mode I actually have the ability to select a DT2. So if I then go up to the HUD, you'll see I should have the same kind of symbology I had before. Yeah, they're off to the side. I've got one box and one cross, and hitting NWS allows me to flip those. And that again would allow me to do quite a quick engagement of these targets. And by default, NWS is going to drop me out of RAID, by the way, so I'm now back at the zoomed out view again. These guys over here are now showing as unknown again. These guys are showing as ambiguous. So, that's pretty much all the standard functionality of TWS. There's one more thing that you can do. There's a feature called Spotlight. If I press and hold TDC and release, it will do a spotlight somewhere further away from my current targets. And so if I suspect there's some people over here, I can do a spotlight and just move my antenna over here for a while. While there's a cross in my cursor, I'm in spotlight mode. If I move it over here again, oh, there you go. All of a sudden, I've got these targets again. So this is a way of picking out aircraft that you think might be flying in close formation in another part of your scan volume. And if I tap my TDC, I come out of spotlight mode. Let's re-engage hits. That is pretty much it. That is all the functionality of track while scan. So these are the major modes you have. You've got RWS, you've got TWS, and you can also enter a single target track. One thing to note, although it's a little bit less common, if I have a launch and steer target, one of these starred targets, of course I can engage it with an AMRAAM. Sparrows require an STT though. If I happened to fire on that target right now with a Sparrow, it would immediately enter STT. It won't actually allow me to do an LNS launch using a Sparrow. So that's quite nice. It automatically stops you from doing anything stupid. So that is pretty much all the functionality of the attack radar. I will in a later tutorial episode cover the azimuth and elevation modes and the data link and the employment of air-to-air weapons. I hope that you've all enjoyed that. If you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and comment, and I'll see you all next time.